freezing? Sorry, I apologize. We have two temperatures in this room, on. Well, I think we're going to try to turn the air off altogether. That may be the better option.
I think it's a good idea.
Yes.
Okay, well, good morning. We'll do what we can about the air. This feels a little bit like a hot summer day when you're wearing a tank top and shorts and you go into the meat aisle of the grocery store and are suddenly chattering. We'll see what we can do about the air. So if you could bear with us, it should be warming up just a little bit. Welcome to the Wilson Center and to the latest in our series of talks and discussions that we call Weighing the Rebalance. And these talks have been co-sponsored by the Asia program at the Wilson Center, which is led by my colleague, Bob Hathaway, who's down front, and by the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. And we conceived of this series as a 3-year exercise last fall, hoping that we would be able to bring in a series of speakers, which we're now able to do, from throughout the Asia-Pacific region, who would consider United States and Chinese policies and actions in the region, cooperative, competitive, and commercial. We began with a lecture by Hugh White, the Australian point of view, last fall. We then had Michael Yehuda talking about Japanese, Chinese, U.S. relations. And today, we are going to be focusing on the points of view of the Philippines and Vietnam. I know that this has a sort of a ripped from the headlines quality to it. This is coincidence. This is luck. We actually planned this event initially last November, but events are moving so quickly and on such a grand scale now in the Asia-Pacific region that I think that whether we were focusing on Vietnam or the Philippines or Indonesia or Malaysia or any number of other countries, it might seem equally timely, but particularly, of course, in the case of these two nations in their relations with the United States and China, we have seen over the past several weeks long-standing disputes threatening to become international crises. And as worrisome as the disputes themselves, as worrisome as the deployments of growing numbers of vessels and the ever more adamant assertions of claims all around, is the fact that the involved parties, including the United States and China, cannot even agree on the nature of their disagreements. And we have not begun discussions on managing these disagreements peacefully. We do not seem to have the same views on what might constitute, for example, a fact. What are the rules of evidence? What constitutes a legitimate argument We have yet to reach agreement on these points. What should the role of international law be? And in these disputes, we find that it goes even deeper than these questions about specific rules. We don't agree about the framework in which purported facts or arguments should be considered. Are we arguing, for example, about the past or about the future, about international law or about matters of history? This remains to be determined. All of this is in play. The United States is putting forward increasingly carefully constructed rationales for its positions to find its assumptions about rationality in international affairs rejected. The very assumptions of its arguments are rejected. China, for its part, makes claims about its historical rights and benign intentions that it views as self-evident and feels scoffed at, ignored, and misunderstood, perhaps willfully. So we have a hard time even sitting down together. We disagree not only about rules, we disagree about the rules for rule making. The United States increasingly, and we heard this in President Obama's speech at West Point, the United States argues legalistically for a 21st century rule-based order, as though such an order is firmly established and universally accepted, and as though we always abide by it. China argues historically and culturally for the prerogatives of a once and now revitalized great power, and both sides insist, to date, that the fault lies almost entirely with the other, and each side seems to be waiting for the other to join the ranks of the enlightened. The Chinese call this ji tong ya jiang, a dialogue between ducks and chickens, in which we have a hard time understanding each other's language. And I think both the Chinese and the American sides often experience the rejection of even the theoretical underpinnings of its argument as baffling. It sends us down the rabbit hole, or into a Thucydides trap, or a prisoner's dilemma. Whatever analogy we use, it would seem to be a dark place that is characterized increasingly by table pounding. And if you follow these issues on a daily basis, torrents of purple prose. I was looking at some of the fairly well-regarded blogs on these issues just this morning, and finding that much is written that is unedited, and much is being said that seems to be ill-considered. And it is, we hope this morning that Wilson Center can step into this breach in our usual fashion, which is to try to bring the views of international scholars to Washington. This is the founding principle of the Wilson Center, the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, where we bring every year, both on residential basis and a short-term basis, leading international scholars and seek venues like this one in which their analyses can inform policy. So we're delighted today to have two leading scholars who've come a great distance to be with us to share their views. Professor Aileen Baviera is Professor of Asian Studies at the University of the Philippines and is editor-in-chief of the journal Asian Politics and Policy. She's an expert in East Asian regional security and maritime affairs and territorial disputes. We will also be hearing from Dr. Hoang Anh Tuan, Director General of the Institute for Foreign Policy and Strategic Studies at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. He served also as Minister Counselor of the Embassy of Vietnam in Washington from 2007 to 2010, and you can read their fuller biodata in the materials that were available at the door. We will then hear commentary from Ambassador Stapleton Roy, who's the founding director of the Kissinger Institute and who has served as American ambassador to China, Indonesia, and to Singapore. And then from Sun Yun, a fellow with the East Asia program at the Stimson Center and formerly of the Brookings Institution and the International Crisis Groups. Thanks to all of you for coming. We have asked Dr. Baviera and Dr. Tuan first to speak at somewhat greater length, perhaps about 20 minutes apiece. And we will then have commentary from Ambassador Roy and Sun Yun as discussants, and then look forward to a discussion with all of you. So why don't we begin with you, Dr. Baviera.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. First of all, let me thank the Wilson Center for giving me this opportunity to visit and share my views on this very important issue. It's important for the Philippines. It's important for the region, for the Asia-Pacific region as a whole. And I'm sure...
I beg your pardon, but I'm afraid I do have to cut you off for this. Apparently, one of us on the stage is carrying a BlackBerry, which is on, or some other device, which is sending our audiovisual people, giving them a lot of difficulties on the technical aspects of this. So, is it definitely a BlackBerry?
Only BlackBerry. I have an iPhone.
Okay, let's go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Yes. All right, so what I'll be sharing this morning are my personal perspectives, of course, on the issue, focusing largely not on the Philippine perspective per se, but my views on recent developments in the South China Sea and how this impact on China-U.S. ASEAN relations. First of all, let me just say, when we talk about the South China Sea, there are really various levels of security challenges involved here. It's a very complex issue, and among the security challenges here, we have territorial and sovereignty disputes, obviously, have become very sharp. Disputes over maritime rights and jurisdictions, which largely have to do with resource use. Non-traditional security challenges also are part of the picture, and great power competition and rivalry for influence. So among these four levels, I guess you could say that the most likely triggers of conflict right now arise from the sovereignty and resource issues. But it's the last type of security challenge, potential for great power competition, which is most worrisome for many in the region. The situation has also evolved significantly in recent years and even weeks, as many of you know. And what is new about the current situation are, I would say, three things. One is increasing unilateral actions on the part of China, exercising jurisdiction over the areas within what it calls the 9-dash line, with little regard for the rights of other states as provided for in the Law of the Sea Convention. These actions by China also involve increasingly civilian, paramilitary, as well as military assets ready to back up their actions and Chinese policies. A second new development has been the stronger pushback by other states with competing claims, particularly Vietnam and the Philippines, but also growing expressions of concern by other ASEAN states, as we could see from the last summit and the meeting of foreign ministers, where a separate statement on the South China Sea was issued. Among ASEAN, there's also common recognition of the risks to regional stability and security arising from the disputes and the conflicts here. A third new development, I guess, is a clearer and more appropriate expression of U.S. strategic interests in the issues involved here, from what used to be a strong statement of promotion of freedom of navigation and non-use of force. Now there is more clearly reference to the need for a rules-based approach anchored on international law, and indications of strong support for allies, which are, of course, being challenged by China. Now, China's position itself is very much of a puzzle for many in the region. There are enough, I suppose, explaining factors as to the driving forces behind China's growing assertiveness, but it nonetheless is puzzling to us because of the outcomes of Chinese actions. The outcomes appear to be not to the benefit of China and not advantageous to China's, how China at least has defined its diplomatic and foreign policy goals in the past. And the outcomes include growing intervention by the United States, growing interest by the United States, a possible movement towards rearming by Japan, and increase in the mistrust between China and ASEAN countries. So that brings us to the question, what is the end goal of China, and what does it consider as its priority interests now? So I have questions rather than answers for that. Do sovereignty and resource needs trump other goals now, such as regional stability and the benefits of regional economic order that China has enjoyed in the past? Are security and the need for power projection more important to China now than before? Or is China even gearing up for the anticipated quote-unquote power shift? And as I said, these are questions and puzzles for us. And because we have these questions, I think it's very important for regional states to have an accurate and common understanding of China's new goals and objectives, its political diplomatic strategies, aside from the advances in its military capability, so as not to underestimate China's capacity and will, but also not to overreact to China, and also so as not to fall into what others would perhaps consider a trap of provocation in what it has been undertaking. Now, how does ASEAN perceive China? As in the past, ASEAN countries have many different perceptions of, and interests in relation to China. But owing to recent developments, I think China has managed to erode goodwill even from more neutral parties, no? Such as Indonesia, even Malaysia, by impinging on interests in the southern reaches of the Nine-Dash Line. No? Many countries are concerned that would say, for instance, that China has begun to show its true colors. No? So it's no longer pursuing the policy of biding one's time and hiding one's capacity, or Tao Kuang Yang Hui. No? Thus, the question is, what kind of regional power will China be? We are perhaps seeing the indications now. No? Some of the ASEAN countries are, however, also concerned about how competition among the great powers will play out and undermine their interest in relations with China, or even undermine ASEAN's autonomy and neutrality over the long term. So it's not just concern over China per se, but concern about how China's behavior will affect the larger picture and the dynamics of relations among the countries affecting ASEAN. We are also seeing more serious hedging strategies emerging in the region, and this is translating into arms buildup and movement towards closer security cooperation among some of the ASEAN countries, as well as between some of them and powers like the U.S. and Japan. If we look at ASEAN's role in this, no, largely, I think ASEAN, or the Southeast Asian countries, recognize the immutable fact of geography. No? That in the face of an increasingly assertive, or even potentially hegemonic China, there's bound to be some pushback. No? But short of that kind of behavior by China, many countries would define their interest still as developing good relations with China. No? So that when push comes to shove, the question is, will pragmatism that ASEAN and China have been known for prevail in the long run? On ASEAN's role as well, the ASEAN-centered diplomacy must be seen to be more effective than it has been in the past. No? For instance, the negotiations now are for the Code of Conduct should focus more on the actual challenges that we face. No? Therefore, prevention of armed conflict, agreement on binding rules of behavior with monitoring and verification mechanisms, and creating a more predictable environment under which to pursue future cooperation regimes, for instance, for maritime law enforcement, including, I think what is very important, a modus vivendi on fishing and oil resource interests. Unless ASEAN is more effective in pushing for these goals, then its multilateral diplomacy risks being sidelined by the unilateral acts of various states and bilateral deals that may or may not, over the long term, contribute to long-term solutions on this issue. Okay. What about the role of the United States? The U.S. on this issue, I think, has a wide range of instruments and options to try to influence the behavior of China, as well as ASEAN and other stakeholders on this issue. And these instruments range from political to economic to social and even military, the use of hard power. No? Looking at the political role of the U.S., for instance, active diplomatic engagement and support, no? In evolving rules-based approaches to conflict resolution, relying on international law, norms and international law, no? Working through the existing mechanisms such as in ASEAN and the EAS, or the East Asia Summit, helping strengthen these institutions, I think, will be important measures for the U.S. to consider. No? In terms of its economic engagement, it can intensify its bilateral and multilateral engagement with Southeast Asian countries. Part of of course, as you know, the reasons for China's growing influence has been its very successful economic linkages. No? And the benefits that many ASEAN countries believe they derive from this. No? So especially as ASEAN moves on towards closer integration through the ASEAN Economic Community, there will also be opportunities to play new roles, no? and perhaps for the United States to establish a stronger economic presence. No? Social aspects, there's a wide-ranging agenda for multilateral cooperation here that may bear upon the South China Sea situation. For instance, environment, climate, humanitarian assistance, disaster response, non-traditional security issues. And as far as military role is concerned, capability building for traditional security and non-traditional security management by ASEAN countries, helping to build a new security architecture, certainly, and institutions for cooperative security. Where necessary, deterrence to encourage peaceful solutions to the sovereignty disputes and regional power rivalries. Has ASEAN perception of the U.S. role changed with recent developments? I think, largely speaking, ASEAN countries continue to be divided in their perception and appreciation of the role of the United States, ranging from those who say that the U.S. can help deter the use of force and promote regional stability, and the other side that says that U.S. involvement will complicate the solution of the territorial disputes by exacerbating China's threat perceptions. So the challenge, I think, is, and key to this is the balance between these two objectives, how to support the first set of objectives, meaning stability, and avoid exacerbating the threat perceptions. My sense is that there's need for a more balanced and comprehensive strategy with different elements of active diplomatic engagement, especially working through multilateral institutions, but also elements of deterrence. On the one hand, high-level cooperation and confidence building with China also would be necessary, and support for international law on the other hand. And the questions over sustained U.S. interest and commitment to Southeast Asian stability will persist, especially given the current political and economic conditions at home here in the United States. There will be pressure to maintain its credibility and continue to assure allies of their support. Okay, so in short, I think the very complex issues in the South China Sea require a multidimensional approach, and there's a collective responsibility of the stakeholder states to move back from the brink and seek lasting solutions here. When we say a collective responsibility, each country, I suppose, will have, or group of countries will also need to identify roles for themselves. No? For instance, in preventing the breakout of serious armed conflict by, say, signing the Code of Conduct and ensuring, most importantly, ensuring its effective implementation. It will be China and ASEAN largely responsible for that. No? Encouraging an early resolution of the territorial conflicts and maritime jurisdiction overlaps through arbitration, adjudication, and other means, no? Relying on law of the sea and other international law. So the claimants will be largely responsible for that. And I think U.S. support will be very important. But to do that, my sense is it will be vital for the United States to have a clearer position on the law of the sea itself, and a ratification will strengthen its position in advocating for rule of law, rule-based order here. If trends continue of certain powers challenging the status quo by military build-up or occupation, new occupation, or countries exercising unilateral jurisdiction without basis in law, then there will also be a role for deterrence involving hard power. No? And this is what perhaps many in ASEAN are still worried about. No? Sorry. Now, leveling the playing field also is, I think, very important. And there are various ways that states, such as the Philippines, perhaps, try to level the playing field a little bit. No? Our reliance on international law, of course, is one, the arbitration case, alliance systems, developing alliance relationships, and effective multilateralism are all means of trying to reduce, to the extent that is possible, the asymmetry with China. No? Also, a final 2 points, pending resolution of the disputes, no? And with the codes of conduct, that should be put in place, it would still be possible to pursue practical arrangements among the various stakeholders and the claimant states, particularly in the form of regional maritime security regimes underpinned by common norms. But this is a matter not only for the claimant states, but littoral states and other user states of the South China Sea to pursue. And providing mutual security assurances including dialogue and cooperation among the great powers. So let me end by talking about the so-called Chinese curse. The Chinese are supposed to have a curse that they say, may you live in interesting times. So I guess when we look at the situation now in the South China Sea, we are all suffering from this curse. And in a way, China also has made things very interesting for us and for itself. So let me end there, and I welcome your comments and questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Baviera. Dr. Hoang.
Well, thanks, Chair. First of all, I would like to thank the Wilson Center for inviting me to this conference to share with you some of my thoughts on the new developments in the South China Sea, Vietnam's reference of its sea. And as I agree with some of the thoughts that are shared by Aileen about the developments and how that impacts on the China-ASEAN relations, as well as U.S.-ASEAN relations, as well as the regional situation in general. So before I give my thoughts on the developments in the South China Sea, I would like to give you a broader picture of the ASEAN-China relations before the what we see as China's assertiveness recently. Well, in terms of economic relationship between ASEAN and China, and we see that there's a huge potential for ASEAN-China relations, and ASEAN is in the process of completing the ASEAN Economic Community by 2015. So a market of 600 million people, and with the combined GDP of 2.3 billion, ASEAN will become one of the biggest single economic markets in the world, and that also forms firm foundations for ASEAN-China economic relations. And we also see that China, under the new leadership, is in the process of carrying out the deeper economic reform and to make China become a full-fledged economy with the focus on the consumer consumption, services, and innovation. So that will open up new opportunities for economic cooperations between ASEAN and China. So there is also a discussion between ASEAN and China to bring the trade relations between ASEAN and China from the current volumes of $400 billion as of 2012 to 1,000 billion in 2020. And there is also an assumption of the China's investment in ASEAN, which would be about 150 billion by 2020. So that is a huge amount of the trade economic activities between ASEAN and China, as well as the potentials for economic cooperation between ASEAN and China. And also in terms of politics, China used to be an active player in the region. So ASEAN's vision of having more and more partners from outside the region to be actively engaging in ASEAN affairs. And we think that it is not about the balance of power among the major powers within the region, but the balance of interests among the major powers that would have the ASEAN countries, that would have Southeast Asia to become more stabilized, to become more peaceful, become more prosperous. That is why ASEAN welcomed China's move to have better relations with the countries in the region. In 1996, China became the full dialogue partner of ASEAN, and a few years later, in 2002, China and ASEAN signed the Declaration of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, and also in 2003, China became the first ASEAN dialogue partner to sign the TAC, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. So all these opens, new opportunities and hopes for better relations between ASEAN and China. And when we have, when we see the new leaders of China that assumed power in late 2012 and early 2013, with the President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Li Keqiang, and there was even more hope within the regions, about the better development relations between ASEAN and China in the long run. And we have never seen that within 1 year after assuming the leadership position, that both the President and the Prime Minister of China made the visits to all 10 Southeast Asian countries. Such kind of new development we have never seen before. And we have also seen promises from the new leaders of China about the future development, future improvement of Sino-ASEAN relations. And we also see that the economic development, the projections of economic development with China and ASEAN would not be achieved if there is no mutual strategic trust, if there is no peace and security in the region. But with a sudden, and we see that China then changed the paradigm, political paradigm of the relationship with ASEAN. So it surprised all the ASEAN countries. So we, on the one hand, we see new hopes, new visions of the relationship, and then the relationship suddenly shifted to another directions without any people's predictions. And we also see that as frustration with amazement as well. And with the recent installations of China's oil rig in Vietnam's EEZ, and as also mentioned by Aileen, so this is just not an isolated incident, but if you put it in the broader context of China's aggressive behavior in the region, we see that sooner or later China would do that. But the time that China has chosen and the countries that China has chosen has also surprised not only Vietnam but also the countries in the region. And that is why you see why ASEAN reacted vehemently after the installment of China's oil rigs into Vietnam's EEZ. So for the first time in nearly 20 years, we saw ASEAN has made a very, very strong standalone statement about the development of the South China Sea. So that is something new. That is within a short space of time since China installed the oil rigs in Vietnam's EEZ on the 1st of May this year, and about a week later, the ASEAN foreign ministers met in Myanmar, and then they issue a standalone statement. So that is something quite new for the association. Another thing is that ASEAN foreign ministers all expressed the deep concern of the new development in the region, and they also asked the parties concerned to keep restraint and to not worsen the situation. And also the ASEAN foreign ministers also asked the parties to exercise the their practices under the international law, the UNCLOS of 1982, and also the ASEAN-China guidelines of the DOC, and also encourage ASEAN and China to speed up the talks from DOC to COC. And why ASEAN has acted quickly and acted in a united way. Aileen has already offered some of the explanations, and I would like to offer some more explanations as well. Firstly, ASEAN sees that this is not a bilateral issue between China and Vietnam. Also, we see that China has mentioned or has repeatedly stated that this is a bilateral issue between China and Vietnam, and this is not an ASEAN issue, and ASEAN should not intervene in this issue. But actually, ASEAN sees that this is not a bilateral issue between Vietnam and China. This is not only the dispute between the Philippines and China. This is an ASEAN issue, as ASEAN is moving towards to complete the ASEAN security community. So ASEAN members see all of them like members' family. So if one of the members' family has problem with the country outside the region, they also see that this is also the family problems. It is not just a family, a member's problem with the countries outside the region. So this is an ASEAN issue, not just a bilateral issue. And also, it's a bit surprising for countries in the region because China says that this is a bilateral issue, but when there were offered or there were proposals from Vietnam, so about 30 proposals, 30 conversations from the deputy ministerial level up since the incident happened early May to now. We offered for bilateral talks between Vietnam and China to manage the dispute, to settle it in a peaceful way. But all these proposals have been turned down by the Chinese. So they said that this is a bilateral issue, but when ASEAN or when Vietnam has asked China to manage the dispute through the bilateral channels, but all the proposals have been turned down by the Chinese. And the second thing is that the thing ASEAN countries see that this is the ASEAN issue in a way that today China move or install the oil rigs into Vietnam is easy. If China could successfully in installing the oil rigs into our easy, and then perhaps the next day they would move the oil rigs further south, for example, into other ASEAN members, and perhaps all the ASEAN countries would be affected. And a third thing is that that affects the ASEAN-led institutions, and it fourthly it also affects the spirit of DOC, that the countries concerned should not make the situations become worsen, and they would need to manage the disputes through the peaceful and negotiated manner. And we see the situations that is dangerous, that is without precedence in a number of ways. One is that it is a violation of international law. So China's movement of the oil rigs is into Vietnam's EEZ. That is in violation of the UNCLOS of 1982, which China is also a signatory. And the second thing we see is that that is an unilateral actions from China. So in previous incidents or in previous acts by China, when China created such kind of incident like this, they often refer to Vietnam's actions or Philippines' actions as the provocations that make China to do this and that. But this time, China did not refer to any provocations from Vietnam, and they just think they did it, and they did it unilaterally. And a third thing is that this is quite uncertain and unpredictable, not only for Vietnam, but for countries in the region. So before the incident, the relations between Vietnam and China seems to be moving on the right path, and there were expectations and there were hopes from our side for the better relations between Vietnam and China in the future. We have had, we have seen recently the visits by the top leaders of Vietnam to China and from China to Vietnam. The Secretary General of Vietnamese Communist Party visited China in late 2012, and they also agreed to set up the hotlines between the top leaders of the two countries. So what is the hotlines for? The hotline should be used for a crisis like this, but when the crisis happens, we offer to use the hotline to manage the situation. But the hotline has become the deadline. It does not work. So that is the problem. And also, the Prime Minister of China came to Vietnam in late 2012, in late last year. We also signed with China more than a dozen agreements of cooperation. And the two countries have also agreed to set up the 3 study groups, one of which is the study group on the exploration of the possibility of the joint cooperation in the South China Sea. But all these things have then suddenly evaporated. So I think that the countries, not only Vietnam, but also the other countries have now entered a new phase of the relationship with China. We have seen the uncertainty, the unpredictable that the relationship with China might bring about. And the fourth thing is that with China's support of the oil, we see a huge flotilla of the Coast Guard vessels, fishing surveillance vessels, so on and so forth. So for the first time in the region, we see that the act of aggressions is supported by a huge flotilla of paramilitary and civilian forces. So that also serves the purposes of getting the dominations of other countries. So that is a new move that we think that the countries region and Vietnam has not seen it and has now to deal with such kind of situations in years to come. And we see that the mother of all the problems that make the situation has become worsened is the China's declarations of the 9-dash line. So we see that the U-shaped line of the 9-dash line by China is the mother of all the problems. And the 9-dash line, as or as all you have know that there is no geographical coordinates of the 9-dash line, and it was put forward first by a private citizen, and there's no legal ways, no effective administrative control by China of the areas within the 9-dash line. So what is the 9-dash line? Is it a territory? Is it a national border of China? Is it the EEZ? So we have asked not only Vietnam, the Philippines, ASEAN countries, and countries beyond the region have asked China to identify what is the 9-dash line, but there is no persuasive answers from China. And we see that there are conflicting views in China what the 9-dash line is, but as long as you cannot tell us what it is, because you cannot show to the world a virtual borderline. Borderline should have the geographical coordinates, but it is not the case with 9-dash line. So that is the problems that creates all the problems that we have seen right now. So can I have 1 or 2 more minutes?
2.
2, yes. And what would have the impacts on U.S. pivoting rebalancing in the region? So I think there are 4 things that the U.S. should do. One is that the U.S. would have to enforce ASEAN unity. So we have seen that with China's assertiveness in the region, there's some divisions in the region, as recently I have seen in several previous ASEAN summits. But it is not in the interests of ASEAN. It is not in the interests of China or the U.S. or of any other countries. We need to have a united ASEAN, and we also need the assistance from outside. It is not an effort from inside, but pressure efforts from outside would be highly appreciated. The second thing the U.S. would do is that to encourage China to engage in negotiations with ASEAN, with countries concerned for negotiated and peaceful solutions to the situation. And we should not accept China's aggressive behavior. And if China would successfully to take on Vietnam, so there would be no limit of China's action in the future. So this kind of thing would be tantamount to the appeasement policy that we have seen things that have led to the Second World War. So that is a dangerous situation. A third thing the U.S. should do is to enforce ASEAN-led institutions. And a fourth thing is to something to lead a regional international effort to draw new red lines, which is law-based approach. So if I have more time, I will go into details, but I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hoang. We'd now like to invite Ambassador Roy first, and then Sun Yun to offer their thoughts on these issues.
I think we've had a very rich presentations by our two presenters here, which illustrate the complexity of the situation in East Asia, the mix of positive and negative elements that are mixed together. But they were filled with detail, and I would like to sort of oversimplify to try to illustrate why the issues we're discussing are so important to the United States as well as to the countries in East Asia. I think it's been true that East Asia has been the most successful region in the world in the last few decades, but it's also been the most dangerous, because until the Ukraine crisis emerged in Europe in the post-Cold War period, it's been the only region of the world where the issues possibly could generate great power confrontation. And we're now seeing that possibility more starkly than we have before. But let's look back at the last 65 years very quickly to try to understand what is going on. We can take that 65 years and roughly divide it into the first 30 years, when East Asia, beginning with 49 with the formation of the People's Republic of China, essentially East Asia was divided into the communist camp and the non-communist camp, with some non-aligned members between the two camps. It was a time of strife and confrontation. Korean War, Vietnam War, Chinese, Vietnamese, both South Vietnam and a unified Vietnam clashes over the South China Sea Islands, China occupying the Paracel Islands, culminating in '79 with the Sino-Vietnamese border conflict. But the '70s was a transition period. With the end of the Vietnam War, during the '70s, essentially the bifurcation of Asia into two camps began to end, with most of the countries that didn't have diplomatic relations with the communist countries establishing diplomatic relations, and the most dramatic of the overcoming of these barriers was the U.S.-China announcement in December '78 that they'd reached agreement to establish diplomatic relations. This coincided roughly with China's adoption of a radical shift in its economic strategy through the adoption of the reform and openness policies. And so beginning in the 1980s, we began to see Asia beginning a decades-long period of rapid economic development combined with democratic transformations throughout the region. Democratic governments emerging in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Thailand, with some fluctuations there, and in Indonesia in the late 1990s. So we had rapid economic development, massive growth in inter-regional trade, positive developments in terms of the political environment in the region, and it was a unified region in which countries were able to deal together. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which had been formed in 1967 when Indonesia ended its confrontation with Malaya over the formation of Malaysia, had shown that it had the cohesion forged during the period of the Vietnam War to remain a significant organization. It brought the former communist countries of Indochina into it, and it became the driver of interaction among the countries of East Asia, continuing right up to the near present time with the formation of the East Asian Summit, which brings together all of the countries of East Asia at the summit level, plus India into the bargain. So we've had this very positive period, but we are now facing a significant change in that environment. Let me just highlight it by looking back 10 years and contrasting that with what we see now. 10 years ago, China and the 10 ASEAN countries had recently, in November 2002, signed a declaration on the conduct of parties in the South China Sea, which provided, among other things, that the parties would resolve their territorial and jurisdictional disputes by peaceful means without resorting to the threat or use of force through friendly consultations and negotiations, and exercise self-restraint in the conduct of activities that would complicate or escalate disputes and affect peace and stability, including, among other things, refraining from inhabiting presently uninhabited islands, reefs, shoals, or cays, and other features, and to handle their disputes in a constructive manner. A year later, China and ASEAN established a strategic partnership. China and Russia, 10 years ago, were about to sign a border agreement that finally resolved the remaining territorial issues along their lengthy common border by transferring from Russia to China all or part of several disputed islands in the Amur River. Trade between China and Japan was growing rapidly, and China was soon to become Japan's largest trading partner. China is the largest trading partner of all U.S. allies in East Asia and of many of our friends there. The third round of negotiations over North Korea's nuclear program were about to begin in the six-party talks, leading a year later, on September 19, 2005, to a joint statement in which North Korea agreed to abandon all nuclear weapons programs and return to the NPT as soon as possible. China and the Philippines had reached an agreement to strive for a solution to their dispute over islands in the South China Sea through bilateral friendly consultations, and China's President Hu Jintao was preparing to make a state visit to the Philippines in 2005. So that was the situation just 10 years ago. Let's look at the climate now. North Korea has conducted 3 nuclear weapons tests and is preparing for a 4th. Relations between China and Japan have plummeted to the worst state since they established diplomatic relations in 1972 because of their conflicting positions with regard to the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. Tensions between South Korea and Japan, 2 U.S. allies, have increased to the point that top leaders of the 2 countries cannot meet except through the good auspices of third parties. Both the Philippines and Vietnam are locked in potentially dangerous confrontations with China over disputed islands and waters in the South China Sea. The territorial disputes between China and 4 of the 10 ASEAN member countries has the potential to weaken ASEAN solidarity, which would make the region of Southeast Asia much more vulnerable to great power rivalry. Little progress has been made toward negotiating the binding code of conduct in the South China Sea, as provided for in the 2002 declaration. Public opinion polls show that hostile attitudes in China toward the United States have tripled over the past 3 years. From less than 10% of those queried, less than 10% saw the United States as a hostile country in Chinese polls, and now they show that over 25% see the United States as a hostile country, largely because they perceive the United States as backing countries with territorial claims against China. Strategic rivalry between China and the United States has increased as each side seeks to improve its military position with respect to the others. This is only a partial list, but it's sufficient to illustrate that in contrast to 10 years ago, there are a variety of dark clouds hanging over the East Asian success story. There's an enormous amount at stake, and part of the problem is this unified region of East Asia is now in danger, if governments adopt the wrong policies, of again being divided into countries who are lining up against China and countries who are choosing to cooperate with China. There are enormous contradictions in the region. China, for example, faces a massive contradiction between its commitment to peaceful development, which amounts to an acknowledgement by China that it's not going to repeat the mistakes of other rising powers, but it's also committed to upholding its territorial integrity and sovereignty issues, and it has disputes with 6 countries around China's borders over territory. And China controls some of the disputed territory, but not other parts of the disputed territory. So how do you uphold your territorial integrity peacefully? These are some of the key issues out there. The United States has major contradictions in the region. I've already mentioned that 2 of our closest allies in East Asia, South Korea and Japan, are having lots of bilateral tensions at the moment. And the United States is an ally of Japan and of the Philippines, both of whom have territorial disputes with China that could potentially drag the United States into conflicts with China over islands that, from the standpoint of the United States, are of no intrinsic value from our standpoint. So these are contradictions affecting both the countries of the region and great powers like the United States that are heavily involved in the region. One of the underlying factors here that is really troubling in the region is the absence of a clear set of strategies by the major powers that is affecting their behavior patterns. Let me start with the United States. We and China are disturbed by the growing strategic rivalry between the 2 countries, and the leaders agreed explicitly in Sunnylands when they spent 2 days of detailed talks together that they would try to create a new type of great power relationship that would bring this strategic rivalry under control. It's the responsibility of leaders to create public opinions that are supportive of their strategic goals. Let me ask you, are the U.S. leaders and Chinese leaders in their public statements adopting positions that are consistent with the goal of creating a new type of constructive great power relationship? I don't think so. Let's look at China and Japan, locked in bitter confrontation over these Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Where is the strategy? Does Japan believe that it can create a positive East Asia environment by adopting the policy approaches that it's now taking? And what about China? Can China continue peaceful development and reach its development goals by 2022 and by 2049, which it has set for itself, if it continues in a path that brings it into confrontation with its neighboring countries? In other words, where is the strategy that is driving the actions by the great powers? Now, there is, in a sense, one, and it's the U.S. rebalancing strategy. In 2008, the global financial crisis damaged the U.S. image internationally fundamentally, so that Europe and East Asia, everywhere you travel, you will see people who believe the United States is a declining power. But if China continues to rise in East Asia, and the United States is seen as a declining power, and if we begin, because of budgetary problems, to lower our posture in East Asia, then our reliability as a balancer against China is fatally compromised. So the rebalancing strategy essentially amounts to a strategic commitment by the United States to retain a position in East Asia sufficient not to contain China, because that's not the policy, but to balance China's rise, to discourage it from using its growing power arbitrarily in order to pursue its national goals. It's a sensible strategy. The United States has the national interest in East Asia to make it credible, and we have the resources already in place in the region to enable us to play this role. But the question is, are we going to be successful, and will we be able to maintain the confidence of our friends and allies in East Asia in pursuing this goal? And can we make it compatible with the goal of trying to create a new great power relationship with China that can contain the strategic rivalry that's inherent in our relationship? These are the big challenges. And what we have heard from our presenters here is an example of the difficulties that we are now encountering. It's vitally important that we use our role in the region, one, as some of the presenters said, to strengthen ASEAN unity. We shouldn't act in a way that will weaken, because the balance in East Asia is more easily maintained if there is cohesion among the 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And secondly, we need to have a clear strategy that motivates both our public statements and our actions that is aimed at bringing strategic rivalry factors under control and not making bilateral disputes worse. But this is a challenge that also has to be taken up by Japan, by China, and by other key players in the region. We're not seeing it at the moment, and so therefore there's an enormous amount of work that has to be done ahead. Let me end on that point. May you live in interesting times. The Chinese have a phrase, 多事之秋, which refers to troubled times. The may you live in troubled times is an Irish version of it. The Chinese don't have any saying along those lines, but they do have a term that describes times of troubles. Whether it's in Russia or in China, there have been such times in the past.
Thank you, Ambassador Roy. Sun Yun, Katie.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Ambassador, for the insightful comments on the strategic big picture. I hope that 10 years from now that we don't have to look at a darker picture.
So do I.
Thanks very much to the Wilson Center for the invitation to be on this panel, and thanks to the two panelists who presented very comprehensive views from the Philippines and Vietnam on the situation in South China Sea. I was asked to discuss the development in South China Sea from a Chinese perspective. I wish to start by saying that I will not focus on the validity or the strength of China's claims and its positions, which most likely will evolve into an endless discussion of who did what, when, and where, and as well as right or wrong. Those are important, and the experts here are much more qualified to discuss them than me. So instead, I wish to focus on a few practical issues on China's current policies. First of all, like the two panelists pointed out, why is China behaving assertively or even aggressively at this particular time? There are indeed multiple explanations and factors. So for one, China feels that its unilateral restraint in the past has not improved China's position in its territorial claims at all, and that China's inaction actually has resulted in other claimant countries strengthening their presence and claims in the South China Sea. Therefore, for China to improve its positions in the game and improve its positions for any upcoming future negotiation, China has to change the perception or the perceived China unfriendly status quo. This is the most direct and plain motivation and explanation for China. Then on a broader and higher level, we know that China has made it a national strategy since a few years ago to build the country into what the Chinese call a maritime strong power. While China's naval expansion faces multiple choking points in the East China Sea, from Japan down to Philippines, the South China Sea offers China a much bigger arena for naval maneuver with much less constraint. China's maritime capacity and potential will face significant limitations if China does not establish a certain advantaged position in the South China Sea. This does not necessarily indicate that China wishes to treat the South China Sea as its own lake, but it does convey a desire on China's part to claim certain privileges unavailable to the others. From a domestic politics perspective, there are a lot of arguments and a lot of theories relating China's rising assertiveness in the maritime disputes in not only South China Sea, but also East China Sea, to domestic motivations. That Xi Jinping, he needs additional foreign policy credits to strengthen his domestic power base. This series certainly have a lot of strengths, because Xi Jinping's domestic political and economic reforms, such as the economic deepening reform campaign and the anti-corruption political campaign, have touched upon many sensitive issues related to existing interest groups and other senior leaders. So therefore, for President Xi, he needs as much foreign policy credits as possible to build his strongman image and diffuse international criticisms on other policies of his. This explanation does not necessarily suggest that Xi himself does not support or endorse an assertive foreign policy to begin with, but it does add an additional layer of motivation to it. Last but not least, in my personal view, China is behaving assertively in the maritime disputes because it feels it can. This assessment is not only based on China's growing military capacity vis-à-vis the capacities of the Southeast Asian countries, but it is based on an assessment on China's part that the Obama administration has avoided military intervention in most of the cases, including Syria and Ukraine. And the assessment on Beijing's part that therefore it is unlikely for the U.S. to get involved in a military confrontation with China in the last 2.5 years of the Obama administration. China simply doesn't believe that Obama wants to leave that as his foreign policy legacy. China recognizes the difference between Ukraine, which is not a member of NATO, and countries like Japan and the Philippines, which are U.S. treaty allies. However, it's pointed out that when China acted on the Scarborough Shoal, U.S. did not really take any actions. Furthermore, what China has stated as the Shangri-La dialogue in the past few days further reveals that Beijing draws a clear distinction between U.S. allies and non-allies. Madame Fu Ying openly stated that the issue between China and Vietnam has nothing to do with the United States. The implied message here is that Vietnam is not even a U.S. ally, and the likelihood of U.S. military intervention is even more remote, if not non-existent. While China does not wish to run into a military confrontation with the United States, so far the assessment seems to be the risk is manageable, especially in the South China Sea, perhaps less so in the East China Sea. Other than taking coercive civilian, paramilitary, and even military actions to assert China's positions and claims in the South China Sea, China is also resorting to the legal approach in the hope to strengthen its legal argument related to the night dash line that Hoang just pointed out. Through the statement of the Chinese government official media and the analysis by Chinese government analysts, it has become increasingly evident that now China is not abandoning the night dash line. This was not the case a few years ago, because 3 years ago, when you talk to Chinese analysts about the issue of night dash line in China, there were actually still debates about the validity of the night dash line and why and how China might be able to retreat from that position. But today, the voice in China is almost unanimous that China should and will stick to its night dash line claims, as pronounced most recently by the PLA Deputy Chief of Staff at the Shangri-La Dialogue. The contradictions between China's night dash line and UNCLOS have been a long sore spot for China's South China Sea policies. China certainly understands the contradictions very well and has invested significantly in the legal studies to substantiate the historic rights claim. Some Chinese legal experts refer to UNCLOS itself, resorting to ambiguous and inconclusive references to historic titles under UNCLOS, Article 10, Article 15, and Article 298, to claim that UNCLOS does not fundamentally challenge historic titles, and the issue of historical rights has never been resolved by UNCLOS. Therefore, it is an ongoing discussion and an ongoing issue. Other legal experts in China argue that 9-line would not find support from UNCLOS. Instead, these other legal experts try to explore alternative justifications for China's 9-line beyond UNCLOS from other international customary laws or codes of practices. They would argue that the international maritime law is a comprehensive legal system, and UNCLOS is only one of the laws. Despite the differences between these two schools in terms of the details and the angles, almost all Chinese legal experts and policy analysts share the same fundamental argument on the 9-line. That is, since the 9-line predates UNCLOS for 4 decades, and China's sovereignty, sovereign rights, and administrative rights within the South China Sea was formed through the history before the UNCLOS was made. Therefore, the Chinese argument continues: UNCLOS cannot and should not retroactively be applied to supersede China's rights formed historically. In other words, China interprets the international maritime law in a way that UNCLOS should only apply to issues and maritime disputes undetermined as of 1982. Whatever that was already formed and settled, in this case, in China's view, the 9-line before 1982 should be excluded from the stipulations of UNCLOS. I'm not saying that I endorse this position, but I'm saying this is China's position on the 9-line. In addition, still on the legal issues, China has declared its rejection of the dispute settlement mechanisms under UNCLOS in 2006. So even the Permanent Court of Arbitration makes a ruling in support of Philippines' claim, and potentially in support of Vietnam's claim if Hanoi does decide to file it. China will not accept the result, and it will be very difficult for the court to enforce such a decision on China. In my observation, the Chinese policy community clearly understands the weaknesses of the legal arguments. However, having a weak legal argument is better than having no legal argument at all, especially when such legal arguments are backed by a strong national power and a strong national will to assert such positions. In comparison, the reputational cost that both Aileen and Hoang pointed out for China is believed to be manageable. In China's cost-benefit analysis, the real benefits of its coercive actions substantially outweigh the costs. After all, China has other ways, like the pragmatism that Aileen pointed out, mostly China economic resources to improve its ties with Southeast Asian countries, while its goals in terms of its claims in the South China Sea could hardly be achieved through any other method. So for China, the cost-benefit analysis does transpire in a way that China believes its current actions are okay, and is achieving the goals that China desires. I'll stop there and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Sun Yun, and thank you to all 4 of our speakers. I think that you've laid out the contradictions between the positions of all of the individual countries and the contradictions between those countries, some of which seem to be worsening, as we said at the beginning. Would that these matters were discussed between countries in the same tenor that this conversation has been carried out. We are not there yet. I'd like to open it up now to the audience for questions, and would also like to invite our speakers if you'd like to question each other. But let's go to the audience first to broaden the discussion, but please feel free to address each other as well. Why don't we go right down front initially? And if you could please introduce yourself as you ask a question.
Thank you very much. My name is Jean Nguyen. I'm with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Also, I'm an American, and I'm a Vietnamese. And also consider myself a Southeast Asian citizen and a world citizen. So thank you, the Wilson Center, Dr. Hathaway, Dr. Daly, and all the presenters, especially Ambassador Roy and Sun Yun. It's a very complicated pictures, but I would like to take my humble knowledge as a Vietnamese first, and state what I was hoping to hear from Dr. Hoang. I came here to hear Dr. Hoang's from the point of Vietnam, but I didn't get to hear it. So I'm going to say something about Vietnam.
Let's keep it as
Keep it
relatively
short.
short so that we have some time for other questions. Yes, please.
The Spratley and the Paracel Islands belong to Vietnam, and part of it belongs to the Philippines and ASEAN, and that's been the claim for a long time. It's proven historically, and it's recently been proven by the map that Chancellor Merkel of Germany gave as a gift to President Xi, and also recently proven by the French officials. They found that during the time that they were dominating Vietnam, that there were many Vietnamese that has birth certificates dated that they were born in the Paracels. And it was obviously noted by, I'm sure, the Kissinger Institute, Dr. Kissinger, and I'm sure that Dr. Roy know about this, that the Paracels was taken by force by China in 1974, and the whole world witnessed it. So that is something to claim, that Paracel belonged to Vietnam. And recently,
Do you have a question for a member of the panel?
I'm stating the Vietnam's point of view. Vietnam would like to take Vietnam, the 90 million people of Vietnam would like to take China to court because of what I just said, and we support and endorse the Philippines very much. We recently heard PM Dung at the ASEAN meeting on May 11, stating that he's considering it, and we would like to hear it affirmed and taken forward. And we support the Philippines. We'd like to join force with you as Vietnamese. As Americans, I would like to come to the challenge that Dr. Roy put out and as challenges for the U.S. I'd like to add one missing fact that you did not list. That is, in 2001, China entered WTO. And everything started then. Since 2001 to 2008, it's been obvious that they manipulate all the laws, all the international laws by trades in the WTO. They manipulate the currency, the IPR, and many others, the subsidy of the SOEs, and that's how we come up to the TPP. So that's how it turned out now today, that we witnessed that they thought U.S. was in decline because they're rising in power. You gave the look back at 10 years back in 2001 till now. And I think that's a truly strong missing link. And that's how China built up its PLA, its naval, its maritime force.
Okay, thank you. Dr.
I'm not done yet.
Well, I'll give you two more sentences, please. And we need a lot of other people here have questions.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
there's a problem with the people, the fishermen, not only in Vietnam, in the Philippines, and Indonesia, but in Southeast Asia, the whole ASEAN. And speaking on ASEAN benefit for the food situation in ASEAN, not only in the sea, but in the lower Mekong River as well. China has taken all the resources, the fish, the fresh water, the land, the minerals, the bauxites, and so many others. So to conclude, I'm asking all to work on the rule of law, and I bounce back to Johnson's questions, how to enforce it. The enforcement is important because China has the national power, it has money, and it has the will to use its military, the PLA. And right now, President Xi is the leaders of both the PRC and the PLA. And recently, he has already openly signed agreement with Russia to also escalate their power in nuclear. So that's my last question is to you, Dr. Daly. As a Kissinger Institute, I would like to ask you to hold a meeting with Dr. Kissinger, with us, Vietnam, and all ASEAN. I feel that it's not the problem with all the major power. It's not the talk between U.S. and China anymore. It now has to be the talk between ASEAN countries, and Vietnam has to say so.
Okay, thank you. We'll certainly continue to stay. We will be very attentive to these issues. I say they're important as your statements and questions imply. But I would like to use this perhaps to ask Dr. Hoang a question that's been asked a lot in the United States. about the prospects for Vietnam, perhaps like the Philippines, going to the International Court of Justice and seeking a judgment in the Paracels, these other territorial claims? Is that something that might be considered?
As you have already been informed, when the Prime Minister of Vietnam made a speech at the WEF in Manila, and he clearly stated that all options is considered, even the legal options to sue China. So I think that it is the option that is also encouraged and welcomed by regional countries and the international community, because it is the peaceful way to manage the disputes. So any tools, any tools that would use the peaceful means to manage the disputes would be welcome and should be welcomed by the international community, and Vietnam is considering this option. But it is also the only option to get the management of the disputes between Vietnam and China.
Thank you. Bob.
Congratulations to all four of our speakers for really what I thought was very excellent presentations, insightful. I want to follow up on a comment that several of you made about the United States' relationship with ASEAN. I think most of us would agree that one of the hallmarks of the U.S. rebalance to the Asia Pacific has been a greater interest in, a greater engagement with the nations of Southeast Asia. The Obama administration has moved to institutionalize the U.S. relationship with ASEAN. I think most analysts would say that the U.S.-ASEAN relationship is more broadly based and more institutionalized today than ever before. And yet several of you suggested there was even more that the U.S. might do. I think one person suggested the U.S. should work with the member states of ASEAN to strengthen ASEAN. Someone else said the U.S. should help strengthen or encourage ASEAN unity. And I'd like to draw, and I think particularly our two visitors from the region, out a bit more. What specifically do you mean by that? Don't those suggestions suggest that there is a consensus, if not a unanimity, among the member states of ASEAN as to what the next steps should be within ASEAN itself, and what does it mean to strengthen ASEAN, or what's the form of unity, or what are the purposes of unity? I'm less convinced that there is that unity or that consensus there. So what specifically do you think the United States should do, and to what extent is it appropriate for a non-member, the United States, to come in and really play a leading role in suggesting what the member states should do about their own organization? I'm not arguing with the prescription. I'd just like you to give it a little bit more substance.
Aileen, do you want to address that first?
Well, thank you for the excellent question. Well, I think South China Sea issue and relations with China are not the end-all, be-all of ASEAN. I mean, ASEAN has been around for a long time, and I suppose it will continue to be around for a long time. While the current environment certainly puts a lot of pressure on ASEAN to be more united, I think there's still the rationale for states in the region to want to be part of ASEAN remain for a long time. I mean, these are small and medium-sized states in an environment where great powers have very sharp interests trying to survive and prosper economically. So I think those remain. And ASEAN is going into a more intensive period of integration, economic community, social-cultural community, political security community. Now, all of that is, for some areas, this will be baby steps, and it will take a long time. But I think that shows a future of confidence among the regional states that they do have I suppose, a common destiny to create, to build, and that is why there is so much concern about recent developments. And I think that also that also speaks to the role of the U.S. Because the engagement can take place at many different levels. Hedging, in the strategic sense, U.S. does play a role. It always has. This is not new. In the past, maybe in the early years, ASEAN's strategy was to secure its autonomy and stability by keeping the big powers at bay. Since the end of the Cold War, it has been secure its autonomy and stability by keeping all the big powers engaged. But when there are problems in great power relations, then that really creates dilemmas. No? So it's certainly an important question for ASEAN to consider what kind of big power relations will again serve ASEAN's continuing viability. No? I'm speaking not of the organization per se, no? But the region. And to the extent that it can be considered a community. No? Unity definitely is a problem. It's been work in progress. Much more has been institutionalized in recent years to move towards that unity, but it does need support. No? And I wouldn't know about a leading role. You mentioned a leading role for the U.S. No? This is, of course, a debate. Leading from behind, leading from wherever no? Is also a question.
Dr. Hoang, any thoughts?
Well, I have had discussions with several U.S. scholars in Hanoi, as well as in Southeast Asia and even in the United States. And some of them have mentioned that thanks to China's assertiveness, that U.S. rebalancing strategies to Southeast Asia has become ever more smooth recently. So, the U.S. should thank China for its assertiveness. So, first thing. How would we see the U.S. role in the region? So we see that, recently we see more and more shared views between ASEAN and the United States on U.S. role in the region, as well as ASEAN's role in the region as well. So we see that that is something that is a bit different from ASEAN and China's views of prosperity, peace, and economic development in the region. So we see two opposite trends within China and ASEAN and the U.S. But we would wish ASEAN and China would move towards in the same directions as we would have with the United States. And several things that we would see the United States would play in the region. One is that the U.S. would have to strengthen individual ASEAN members. This is very important to make them become more and more resilient economically, strategically, in terms of defense and economic fields as well. Second thing is that you should also have ASEAN as a group to be a strong and united one, in a way that ASEAN would be able to deal the issues that affect themselves in terms of security, economic issues that they are faced with. And we also, thirdly, we also need the U.S. assistance to have strengthened the ASEAN-led institutions. ASEAN should play a driving role in institutions like EAS, ADMM, AIF, and all these things. So I think this is very important, and ASEAN should play as a role to engage not only the U.S., China, but also the other players with the aim of bringing peace, security, and prosperity for the region.
Okay, there was a question here in the middle, and then back to Joe. Then we'll come up front.
Thank you. I'm Richard Cronin with the Stimson Center, colleague of Yun Sun, in fact. I wanted to make a, well, first of all, this is a great discussion, and I think the contradictions are so important to be dealt with, and Yun Sun actually did a very good job of drawing them out from China's perspective. But there is, again, to go back to Ambassador Roy's comment about, you know, the details. Well, yes, we need to rise above them, and you did a great job of doing that, looking at it from a bigger picture. But there is, the details are still there. They are sort of inconvenient truths, if you will, not to coin a phrase. And one thing about the details that keeps getting overlooked is that UNCLOS is really less about sovereignty than about defining what kind of maritime space can be generated by sovereignty. And so this is really an important fact, and then the press discussions of disputes, it just doesn't draw it in at all. So, but to get to the point and the question, it does seem to me that, though, the key for the U.S. in particular is about norms. It's about how those norms are going to be. Are they going to be enforced, or in some way are they going to give way to power? And I'm not saying it's not just power that's behind the norms, because that's partly how they got there. But the main two questions. First of all, would it be useful at all to press, does the panel think, press China about, okay, so you want to make your 9-dash line claim, give us some coordinates, then we can talk about it. Would that be at all useful? And second, the issue of the U.S. not acceding to UNCLOS, how mention has been made that, you know, this is an evolving, maritime law is an evolving thing, and how important is it for the U.S. to not just observe UNCLOS rules, but to accede to the treaty? Thank you.
Sun Yun, do you want to address that first, please?
Sure. I'll focus on the first question about pressing China on the coordinates. I think China's position is at least privately very clear that China has the preparation to draw such coordinates and to talk to countries about such coordinates and what type of maritime rights that China actually claims within the 9-dash line. As an issue that Hoang pointed out, that what does China really claim within the 9-dash line, what it means. I believe China is prepared to answer that question bilaterally, only with the countries and the parties that are claiming countries. And China is not prepared, and China will not, most likely, in my view, bring that issue to international court or bring that issue to a multilateral discussion. So on the bilateral level, when China feels that the opportunity and the situation has ripened for China to do so, China will. But China will not be forced to do so on the multilateral or on the international forum.
That sounds almost tantamount to a secret claim of sovereignty or a proprietary declaration of borders.
I would say they make a distinction between the negotiation and the claim of sovereignty. If China does stick to indisputable sovereignty claims to everything within the 9-dash line, then there will be no discussion and no negotiation at all, right?
State.
Assistant Secretary Russell has already, I think it was in his congressional testimony, called for China to clarify the 9-dash line. It raises an interesting question. China has not clarified the 9-dash line because there's a dispute in China between those who want to treat it as the territorial space of China. That amounts to declaring that the waters of the South China Sea are territorial sea. And there are those in China who recognize the difficulty of trying to justify such a position on the basis of UNCLOS or existing international law. Does the United States pushing China on the question produce the outcome that we would like to see? That's the question I have in my mind. It seems to me that it's not going to necessarily strengthen the hand of the rule of law people inside of China if it turns out that the United States is becoming the advocate of one side in the argument inside China. I don't know how to handle the issue. But in some ways, I see that maintaining ambiguity may be better than having China take an untenable position that will make the whole issue become more difficult to manage. And I also think that it might be better for China to have to work this out with the countries with claims in the South China Sea, rather than trying to deal with the United States position on these questions.
Dr. Hoang, a quick comment.
I think this is not the request from the U.S. It is also the request from the regional countries and other countries concerned to ask China, to identify what it wants, or what the 9 dash lines, means for China, And I think that, it is very difficult, for countries concerned to negotiate with China, on that issue, because, for China itself, they still do not know, what they want with 9 dash line. Even though, so how could you negotiate with people who do not know what they have, what they want? So what is the negotiations for?
Yeah. Well, maybe the other dimension is that the 9 dash line wasn't a Han Dynasty or a Yuan Dynasty map, but it was an invention of the Republic of China. So unless and until China can assure that it and Taiwan have a common interpretation of the 9 dash line, it's not in a position to put anything forward.
Go, Joe.
Joe Bosco, formerly with the Defense Department. Ambassador Roy has made the statement that, or the conjecture that none of the great powers in the region have devised a strategy or articulated a strategy for the region. I would submit that, in fact, China has, and it's a policy of expansionism. I think Yun Sun has pointed out that that policy is working. China is creating facts on the ground, or facts on the rocks, as it were. But in many ways, it's a subtle version of what Japan did in the 1930s. So there is a strategy that is working in terms of short-term versus long-term costs. Yes, many of the countries in the region are reacting to China's aggressive policies. But I think China, as Yun Sun points out, has correctly calculated that over the long term, there will be no real cost for that. This week marks the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, which at the time was considered a major strategic debacle for China. But as the years passed, within 2 decades, it was awarded the Olympics. And it is now, a great power in the region. So I think it sees the same result from these. There'll be some short-term cost in terms of diplomatic relations, but ultimately, none of its facts on the ground will be reversed, and it will be in a far greater position in the region.
Any responses?
Yes, I would. You raise a very central issue in terms of trying to understand what is going on there. First is the question of what constitutes expansionism. Does asserting claims to disputed territories constitute expansionism, as opposed to expanding your power into areas where you don't have a claim? I normally associate expansionism with going outside of the area of your traditional claims and going into the territory of others. But one can argue that question. China does not have a declared policy of expansionism. If that's China's strategy, it's not its declared strategy.
No country has.
So the question is how to handle the question. I think that China's growing assertiveness is in fact creating major costs for China, and that's one reason why China has begun to focus on its diplomacy with countries around its periphery. If you recall, Xi Jinping chaired a major conference they had last October addressing that question of diplomacy around China's periphery. The problem from China is, as it becomes more assertive in pressing its claims in disputed areas, the countries who dispute those claims turn to the United States and want to strengthen our role in the region as a balance against China's actions. So that China is seeing that contradiction. If it becomes more assertive, it drives countries into the arms of the United States, and that's happening all around its periphery, and it's not in China's interest. So I think that China's assertiveness has a cost, and in fact, it's a major cost, because China has, it's the central kingdom, if you will. It's surrounded by an enormous number of other countries, many of whom are major powers.
I'm struck by Joe, by the way you put your question, that we're still, as I mentioned in the introduction, we're grappling for metaphors. For some people it's 1914, for some it's 1930, for some we're in the Cold War. Yan Xuetong of Tsinghua University was here last week hearkening back to the period of the Wang Dao. A sort of China's virtue would attract willing tributaries. So it's an interesting discussion. We're going to come down front, and then we'll go back to you, sir.
Thank you. My name is Agron Alibali. I'm a former scholar here at the Wilson Center, where I work on maritime boundary disputes around the waters of southeastern Europe and the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The question is this: there are at least 23 joint regimes or various forms of condominia of maritime zones in the world today. Has there been any discussions or debates in the political level, academic community, or in the public opinion in the countries concerned to have some form of joint regime in some contested areas in South China Sea? Thank you.
Yes. Well, the closest that we got was when the Philippines, China, and Vietnam had what they call the joint marine seismic undertaking, which was pre-exploration research in certain areas of the South China Sea. It went on for 3 years. It was a 3-year agreement, and then the agreement was allowed to lapse for various reasons. I think in principle, the idea of joint development has been there. It's much more complex because of the multilateral nature of many of the disputes in certain areas. But there has been, China has talked about it for some time, but there really has been no concrete proposal. And it seems that as the years passed, China's position hardened so that any joint development will be under terms of recognizing China's sovereignty, at least according to the Foreign Ministry website. No? So it's become a non-starter.
Well, I think when the questions you have mentioned, that come up with the issues of sovereignty, and everything, gets stuck, like, the disputes in the South China Sea, as China has stated. So countries in the region, even Vietnam, say that, it is not the disputed area, and China, make that area, become a disputed area, and then you ask for joint development. For example, like your backyard, someone, in your neighbor comes with that, well, the backyard, half of your backyard, belongs to me. And now, let's have the joint development in that, So who will accept that? So that is something like that, that comes up all over the time, So the joint development issues, gets stuck. For example, when China asks, for the joint development, with Vietnam and some other countries, and they have wanted, to have the joint cooperation. Some other countries, refer to it as the joint cooperation, not joint development. And they ask that, the joint development areas, should be in beyond any Southeast Asian claimants, 200 EEZ. 200 miles EEZ, but China does not accept that. They have just wanted, in the overlapping areas between the 9-dash line and the ASEAN claimants, of ASEAN's EEZ. So that does not go anywhere.
Okay. So we have a question
Yes.
here, and then we're going to come up front. And if we could please, in the interest of time, because there's still a lot of questions, both questions and answers, as succinct as possible. Thank you.
Xiaopeng Luo worked for the iSound Affair media company based in Hong Kong. So my reading of this is what really China wanted, based on my understanding of China's mentality. Historically, China even willing to give up the land in return get kind of a relationship that China instead, because that's the fundamental for China to rule China, for Chinese rulers to rule China. They can give. So that is their understanding of the core interest is not exact what plot of land or ocean, they may be willing to give quite, big concessions, but in return, you accept the principles how China to rule, primarily inside China. So that is a very fundamental difference there. So my question is, to save China's face or save China this kind of mentality, how far those countries in the state and the U.S. willing to go in order to avoid a major kind of conflict, that is.
So sure, yeah, better you than me. Go.
I see your question. Thank you. I see your question linking the legitimacy of the Chinese government with the territorial dispute and making a connection between these two, asking the question that whether other countries in the region also face, whether would accommodate that problem of China's domestic politics. But I would say that other countries in the region also face the same problem. You don't think the legitimacy of the Vietnamese government or the Filipino government, whoever the president is associated with their ability to protect their territorial integrity? So I would say what applies to China also applies to other countries, and it would be unfair to other countries to make concessions to accommodate China on that.
So maybe both of you on the role of domestic legitimacy as opposed to foreign policy.
Well, yes, I agree with Yunsun. It is an issue for all of the governments. And even in the Philippines, where typically people don't care about foreign policy issues, it's become very much a household debate or discussion sort of topic. But what I actually wanted to raise related to that was Yunsun has been arguing that the Chinese assessment is that the reputational costs are manageable. And that sort of flies in the face of what many of us know as China's attitude. China has all along been talking about saving face, as was raised here. So how does that reconcile? There are a few countries that care more about reputation than China, and we've seen that in Chinese behavior for many, many decades. So, which is why I can't understand how they could come to that assessment.
We will on June 23rd, Evan Osnos of The New Yorker will be here talking about his new book, The Age of Ambition. And at the close of 2013, he described 2013 as the year in which China lost interest in soft power. Maybe was willing to pay the cost. Dr. Hoang.
Well, I think two issues. First, it depends on what kind of books, what kind of historical documents that you have read, that you see that China have made concessions to the other countries. So it depends on the sources that you have. The first thing, and also referring to that the countries in the regions, they have read different stories of China's concessions. So the things that they made even more concessions than you do. So the second thing is that I agree with Yunsun about what China have is also the same things that countries in the region have. So everyone is talking about saving China's face. How about the other countries? Because we are smaller countries, so there's no need that you save our face.
Right. Please.
Thank you very much. Zhang Hong from Caixin Media of China. So we are discussing about legal solution here because I think it emerges as a major objective of the ASEAN countries and also United States to seek for a legal solution here. But I'm wondering, are we ignoring the elephant in the room here, which is the very strong nationalist sentiment in each of these countries? I think the first question very well illustrated this point that people in each of these countries strongly believe this area belongs to my country. So even if there is a legal solution, even if there is a code of conduct, I think people, regardless of the conduct of any law, they still feel that the government should do something to claim back this territory. So I'm wondering, is there any way you can address this nationalist sentiment in each of these countries? Thank you.
Aileen.
Yes. I think the first and the most important step is for the governments to stop saying that this is mine and start saying to their own people that this is disputed. because that recognition alone will pave the way for the publics to think about other solutions.
Any other members of the panel? Oh, yes.
I just want to add a few words. First of all, on the issue of reputational costs that Aileen raised, I would say that for China, for Beijing, for the Chinese government, there is a reputational cost regionally and internationally, but there is also a reputational cost domestically. So for the Chinese Communist Party to meet the demand of the domestic public opinion is probably more important than meeting the public opinion of the region or of the United States. Then on the issue of nationalist sentiment, I would say that actually I think the media in all these countries could play a role. For example, Chinese media could potentially have a fairer or a more fair assessment or demonstration, or simply demonstrate that other countries' claims also have their historical evidence. So for the media to present the public with a more objective picture of what the dispute is all about and the history of such dispute will be highly helpful to shape the public opinion in a more responsible way. But then, of course, whether China's domestic media could play that role is another question.
Okay, it's right in the center, please.
Thank you. My name is Seri Lachik. I'm a retired journalist. I have a question, if I may, about the role that we expect the ASEAN Maritime Caucus. I understand it will have a meeting in Hanoi in August. And the members are Vietnam, the Philippines, Brunei, and Malaysia. I guess the question is how credible, how resolute it will be in presenting the case that you have. The last meeting, I understand that Brunei was a no-show. Malaysia was almost mute until just recently, when all of a sudden it started to speak up. So the question is, what mandate do you expect this caucus to have in presenting your position?
Dr. Hoang.
What I think is, the claimants resolute as well as ASEAN resolute, was much tributed, was much owed to China's assertiveness, because of China's assertiveness. All the countries, first the ASEAN claimants, and then the ASEAN countries, felt threatened by China. And the thing that, the best way is to fight back, to defend their territorial integrity.
Yeah.
So I think that relates to China's assertiveness.
I think for a long time the ASEAN claimants maybe resisted, or some of the claimants resisted having such a forum of the ASEAN claimants only for fear that it would be perceived as ganging up on China, coordinating positions closely, etc. But ASEAN has been doing that anyway, and informally the claimants have been consulting each other anyway before major dialogue forums with China. In terms of the mandate, one thing that might help, because everyone says that this is not only a problem between ASEAN and China, but among ASEAN countries. In the case of the Philippines and Vietnam, we have no overlaps, but we do have issues with Malaysia and so on. So at least as a forum to focus what are the really critical questions to be addressed, and to engage in confidence building among. I mean, those would be some of the things that they could do as claimants.
I think we have time for one more question, if there are any in the audience. Marvin.
Excuse me, Marvin Ott, Wilson Center. There was a lot of expertise on the panel that could address the question of China's historical view, but maybe I'll focus on Yun Sun. This is a 30-second caricature, and then tell me what's wrong with it. China sees this region to the south as naturally, organically, legitimately subordinate to China. John K. Fairbank coined the term tribute system. Chinese have different terms for it. And this is a view derived from history of a natural relationship that is not a Westphalian sovereign system of equal states, but is in fact hierarchical, a more Confucian view, and that what China expects from the region is deference, subordination, and respect for China's interests, and in return, China will grant benevolence to the region, and all will prosper. Would you quarrel with, is that a cartoon? Is that a mischaracterization of what we're looking at here?
Thank you, Marvin. You always have the most insightful questions. Thank you. I actually agree with you. I think in China's perception, although it's not stated, there is a sense of contempt towards smaller countries in the region. Like the Chinese foreign minister back then Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi claimed at an ARF meeting in Hanoi, I believe, that China is a big power, and other countries are small countries, and that's a fact. So the message conveyed by such rhetoric is quite clear that China sees itself differently from other powers from other countries in the region. And I agree with you that China does require a certain level of deference, but I would argue on what issues. For example, on economic issues or on, for example, financial investment, or on other issues that's not related to what China calls the core national interests. It seems to me that Beijing has demonstrated a certain level of willingness to compromise. Maybe that's what you characterize as a return, as a reciprocity with benevolence. But I would say that for difficult issues like territorial sovereignty and territorial integrity, it is indeed very difficult for China, for Beijing to make such concessions. So whether that also qualifies as a demand for deference, I don't know whether it would actually qualify, but I would say that Beijing does have a strong justification for sticking to its positions on these issues. Maybe that doesn't answer your question, but thank you.
Ambassador Roy.
Marvin, I'd make one interjection. The attitudes you have described, in my understanding of history and in my understanding of the United States, are typical of what big powers expect of other powers in terms of dealing with them, or certainly of smaller countries. The United States, in the Western Hemisphere, has behaved entirely consistently with your statement about how China views its territory, and we don't traditionally have a tributary system with it. I think the tributary concept is overused. Chinese are educated in a modern educational system. It's like the Monroe Doctrine. China has moved beyond, it seems to me, tributary relationships with its neighbors, but it is going to always have that great power sense that smaller powers should pay due deference to the interests of the great power. We see Putin expressing the same concepts in the areas around Russia. I could cite historical examples. The British were that way. Certainly the French were that way. The Germans were that way. Let's not put too much weight on history and look at it more in terms of the way that countries deal with each other. I think it gives us better insights.
And China also, if it were to look back at the time when it was more central and it had these kinds of tributary relations, it now finds that the combined populations, military and economic power of its border countries exceed that of China. The United States and other powers furthermore exist. So I see China struggling between these default preferences and these deeply imbued cultural dispositions and its extremely well-informed recognition of these facts. And we're watching China trying to figure this out. The notion that there is a set strategy and that determination has been made and they're proceeding in accordance with it, I simply don't see that happening. I think we're seeing something play out. Well, I want to first thank our panelists and especially Dr. Baviera and Dr. Hoang, who have come so far, for giving us a very dispassionate and therefore very helpful analysis of complicated issues beneath the surface of which, and often above the surface of which, we see an extremely passionate views. And this has come out in some of the questions and some of the answers. I'm afraid that having heard this dialogue and having been reminded both of its complexity and of the passions, I end where I began, which is that as of today, of this snapshot, these sound like rather intractable positions. I hope that we will see some positive movement on them soon, but I'm not sure that we have based on today's discussion, that there's a lot of light at the end of what I hope is a tunnel that leads somewhere. But do stay tuned. Certainly the Kissinger Institute and the Asia program, through Wang, Rebalance, and other programs, are going to continue to have these discussions. We are very open to your suggestions for the kinds of programs that you would like to see as well. So once again, thank you to our panelists. Thanks to all of you. We hope to see you on June 23rd for Evan Osnos talking about the Age of Ambition, which is not about U.S.-China relations, but I'll be on the stage with him sort of dragging out some of the implications of his observations for China for the United States as well. So I hope to see you then. Thank you very much. I don't see what else we could do. That was very good.
Super nice. Very nice.
Honor to be with such intelligent